Begin the current Daf, Pesachim Daf Tzadik Zayin. Begin 6 lines down at the top of the Yomim. The Gemara continued the discussion in the previous Daf. Essentially, really, what we had in the previous Daf, Machlekes Rabbi and Zera, regarding the halacha of our Mishnah. That Rabbi Shloimy introduced regarding Tamur, and we keep it qualified regarding the Pesach Shenimtza. Again, you have an original carbon Pesach, it was lost, and then you ended up finding it, depending, we said if you find it before the replacement is slaughtered or not, which we had a machlekes doesn't mean when it's actually slaughtered, the shechita itself, when the zman of the shechita chatzos, that's really going to be the theme of today's daf, continuing on that idea. Today's daf, some of this we're going to discuss in today's daf, is really essentially all comes down to one teaching of Shmuel. Shmuel is going to compare a chatas she'avar shnasa, a chatas that has already passed its limited time, where the halacha is, it's left to graze and develops a blemish, and then the proceeds are brought as a carbon, to Pesach she'avar shnasa, which in the equivalent by the Pesach is going to be brought as a shlam, which the halacha relates to this concept of chatas shemesa, because the halacha of chatas is when it dies. That's when we say Pesach is brought as a shlam. Regarding, however, when the chatas is left to graze, that's when the Pesach is going to be left to graze, because that's halacha meshritzina. When you have 5 chatois, that the halacha is that generally it's year actually staying, but by chatas, unique halacha that's been left to die, which is the carbon of a female carbon chatas, or the tamura of a chatas, or the chatas that only died, or chatas that only got to come with some other carbon, or chatas she'avar shnasa and past its year. So that's a unique halacha l'meishim yisina. By chatas, it's going to be used by Shmuel as a springboard, as a siman, to qualify the halacha as relates to that of carbon Pesach. So we're going to current down. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says the following mnemonic, the following teaching. It says, Kol shebechatas mesa, wherever by a carbon chatas, that the carbon chatas is going to die. Like Rashi points out, as we mentioned before, there's 5 types of chatas that they halacha meshum sinai that to be left to die. What does that mean? I mean, you put them into a cage, and the animal dies. And that's like we mentioned, it's the vlad chatas, it's the child of the chatas. Let's say that it's a chatas, a female, and it has a baby. That child is left to die. The tamur of a chatas, if you try to switch the sanctity, or chatas that the owner died. So now what do you do with the chatas? Left to die. Or if you have a chatas that only got to come with some other one, which is really the case we're going to be speaking about, what's called avuda, which we discussed in the previous time, where you lost it, and then it was subsequently found. And avar shnasa, which is if it went through, it's already past its first year, it's not valid as a carbon chatas anymore. So Shmuel is using, for the laws of Pesach, as a siman, and he says that wherever by a carbon chatas the animal dies, so the Pesach, if such a thing would happen by a carbon Pesach, karev shlamim, it would be sacrificed as a shlam. As Rashi explains, the Gemara assumes right now that Shmuel is going on all the cases of chatas shemesas, like it sounds like from his statement, that if the equivalent would happen by Pesach, it would be sacrificed as a carbon shlamim. Which, what would that mean? Well, a carbon Pesach can't be, you can't have a vlad with a Pesach, because a Pesach is a zach or is a male. But you could have the tamur of a Pesach, you could have a Pesach that the owner died, you could have a Pesach that the owner got atonement, or you could have the 4th one if it already passed its year, because a Pesach is also only valid in the first year. Just one of them is impossible, because you can't have vlad Pesach, because the Pesach is a zachar, and the carbon chatas could be a female. But the other 4, what? No, then it wouldn't. Exactly. The only halach these 5 types of things, then they have to die. But mum, then it's a grade, then it already has a mum. You could deconsecrate it. You could use its proceeds. You don't have to let it die. That's a unique halach over here. So wherever a chatas, and feel free to jump at any point. There's a lot of chesed over here. Any place where a chatas is going to die, by Pesach, the equivalent, the Pesach will be brought as a shlam. Now, but wherever the case would be by Chama Chatas that would be left to graze, which is later on going to explain what exactly is that case, meaning it's not going to die, then by Pesach Nami Raya. Then by Pesach it's also going to be left to graze until it develops a blemish. Now, as Rashi explains, the fact by Chatas, if it dies or it's left to graze, it's not because of a leniency or a stringency that you have by one over the other one. The reason why we're picking regarding Misa by Chatas, that was saying, in that case by Pesach it's going to be sacrificed, and that by the case of where Chatas is left to graze, by Pesach being left to graze, it's not the reasoning. It's not because over here it dies, therefore over here it's going to be sacrificed. Like Rashi's words are Simona Ma'almahu. And this is really a lot of the daf, you have to really keep that in mind. We're going to be just qualifying. Shmuel came up with a mnemonic. He gave her the simon to remember. Says, oh, you're going to wonder one time what's the halacha of the Pesach. I'll give you a way to remember. The way you remember is like this. Kol shebechatas meisam, Pesach kav shlamim. And by chatas is raya, Pesach will be raya. But it's not because the chatas dies. It's a chumrah that it dies and therefore Pesach is to be carved. It's not nothing to do with that. It's just a simon beyond. That was Shmuel's statement. Fine. Now, Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Shmuel, which actually the Gemara later on is going to explain exactly what is the machlekes. He says, in a Pesach karb shlamim, you're not going to have a karb Pesach sacrifice of shlamim, only if you find it after the slaughtering of the replacement one. But if you found it, the original, before you slaughtered the replacement one, then then it's going to be rejected, which is essentially what like Rabbah said on the previous daf, which actually the Gemara ultimately is going to say this on Amud Beis. The Shmuel really is saying it depends if you found it before or after Chatzas. Rabbi Yochanan is going to say it depends if it's before or after the actual Shechita. So it's essentially, the Gemara is not explaining it over here. Gemara Amud Beis will essentially tell us that. But we're going to focus primarily on the teaching of Shmuel, and then later on at the end of the daf, we'll bring in back again this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. But first, Maskela of Yosef. Yosef asks on Shmuel, because Shmuel had said that the halacha is that again, by Chatas Mesa, Pesach is going to be Karv Shlam. And he says, B'chol Chatas Roya, but Pesach Nami Roya. So Yosef says, is that really a general rule that wherever by the Chatas it's left to graze, by the Pesach is left to graze? But by Chatas, and again, it's complicated, you have to help up by the cases of what we're talking about. He says like this, by Chatas Sh'avish Nasa. If you have a Chatas that passed its year, again, the Chatas is only kosher in the first year. Certain karbanis or certain ages, a Chatas, if it passed its first year, the halacha is, it's left to graze in that case, as the Gemara proves this. He says in Masechtas Tamura, the Bezim and Aleph, actually Rashi points out that the Gemara asks over there from the Mishnah over there, because the case we're going to discuss over here is Avish Nasa, and the Mishnah over there says, actually Avish Nasa is Lamisa. The Gemara there answers and says, no, it's only if Avish Nasa and it was lost, or was lost and you found it about Mum, which is what you had pointed out. But if it's only the case that we can discuss over here, Chata Sha'avish Nasa, only that it passed this year but it wasn't lost, then actually Rishon Malaka says, Ryan I said, and you see that Chatas, wherever it is, as if it's in a cemetery. I mean, what does it mean a cemetery? It means a kohen can't go into the cemetery because of tum over there to shecht it. So it's like it's something that you cannot slaughter as a carbon. And rather what happens is you leave it to graze until it develops a blemish, and then you sell it, and then the proceeds are used for that which is in the Beis HaMikdash, where you pat this box on the davos, which your Yoda HaKoyin, as the Gemara brings in this Mechlis Tamura, had said, all the moisture chatas ma'ashim, all the leftover funds of a chatas ma'ashim, is l'keitz mizbeach, is that when they didn't have any karbanos, they would bring these karbanos, except for the 5 cases of halach Moshe Sinai, where the chatas are left to die. But if it's any other case, like the case over here, where if you have a chatas that passed its year, although we mentioned that before, as one of the chatas, the 5 that are left to die, so that's what Rashi brings from the Gemara, but that's only if it, besides it was over a year, it was also lost. But if it's only past this year, then Rishon Malaka says actually it's not one of the 5 that's left to die, it's left to graze. Okay? That's important to remember, because every time we're going to be matching up, does it hold out? Shmuel had said, if it dies, if it would happen by Pesach, it would be Shlamim. If by Chatas is left to graze, by Pesach is left to graze. So it has to fit that equation. Problem is, you tell me a Chatas Shabbos Nasa, it's left to graze. But the equivalent by the case of Pesach would be carved Shlamim. That doesn't work with your Siman. It would be a Shlamim. Because the Tanya, we learned the Brisa, and that's why we mentioned the previous daf. It was brought in the previous daf. The Brisa had said, it says Kesef, which we had said it's not necessary to say Kesef, because we know it's talking about a lamb, because you already said sheep, which sign includes that of Kesef and Eiz. So in saying goat, you already said, so obviously it's talking about lamb. So why to say that extra word? L'Rabba says a Pesach La'ali. It's coming to include the Korban Pesach, that the fatty tail is also sacrificed with the Korban Pesach. Now, in Kesef, we said the word im is also extra. So what's that coming to tell us? L'Rabba says a Pesach Shavish Nasa. This is the case. The Korban Pesach, it's only valid within its first year. If it passed the first year, and another case. B'Shlomo Boy Machmas Pesach, and also the Korban Shlomo comes with the Pesach, which we have 2 interpretations. Rashi, whether it be the Chagigo or the Meiser Pesach, be that as it may. What's the halacha of Pesach Shavish Nasa? L'chol Mitzvah Shlam, it'll have all the halachas of a Shlamim. Shetur B'Smichi, you have to lean on it, B'Nesachim, pouring these wine libations, or Shnuvas Chazar Mashayk, you have to lift up and elevate the breast and the thigh. And Kshoimer, when it says V'im Eis, and then when it continues on to the goat, why say Im over there? That's Hifsik Inyan. This is parenthetical. It's just stopping. Limit al Eshe tell you that the goat does not require to sacrifice its fatty tail. But one thing is that it says Pesach Shalosh Nasa that you're going to be makavit as a shlamim. You're not going to be raya. That contradicts your concept. You said that whatever by chatas is going to be raya, Pesach is going to be raya. It's not true. I found your case of Shalosh Nasa, which by Pesach is going to be karv shlamim, yet by chatas is going to be raya. Oh, so the Gemara here shifts over here. Amalei, he says to him, you're right. Kikar Shmuel. When did Shmuel say his mnemonic, his simon, that whatever by the chatas is going to die, then by Pesach it's going to be sacrificed as a shlamim? Wasn't going on all the chatois hamesas. No, rather he was going be'avudin, which is really the theme of our previous stuff from our previous Mishnah. Only going in the case of where the owner got atonement with some other carbon. That's what's called kippur bailim. Well, that would be because you lost the original one. But b'dchuyin, but regarding a case where the carbon was rejected, what is that case? Well, in the context of the Gemara's question, that was regarding Avish Nasa, regarding if it passed its year. That's not avudin. That's the case of it got rejected. Rashi also points out another case that we're not talking about is Mesu Ba'aleh. The owner dies. That's also a case where it was rejected. That Lo Amar, that Shmuel didn't say. And Rashi says, you know why? That we're not talking about the rejected cases, because one of the rejected cases is the one the Gemara asked from, which was Avish Nasa. But another one would be Mesu Ba'aleh. Now, Mesu Ba'aleh, you cannot have the second rule of Raya. You can't have, when the owner dies, the halacha that it's going to graze. You could only have it by Kippur Ba'aleh. When the owner got atonement, that's where you have the case of it's being left to graze, as Gemara will explain later on. So by Pesach also, the equivalency that we're comparing it to say that it's going to have Mesa and Raya, is only by the case of Avudin. Meaning, if we want to give you comparison to Chatas, that sometimes it's going to be Mesa, sometimes it's going to be Raya, you only have that in the case of Kippur Ba'aleh. But Mesu Ba'aleh, for example, which is a case of Dechuyin, that the carbon gets rejected, not because it was lost, because there's no owner, or the equivalent of what the Gemara's question was, Avish Nasa, that you can't have ever a case of Raya. So the case of Pesach also, that we're saying it's going to be something's karb shlam or Raya, is going on the case of when the owner gets atonement. So essentially the interpretation as the Gemara says it right now, as Rashi explains it, is like this. Wherever you have by a Pesach that the owner gets atonement with some other carbon, when is it going to graze? If the equivalent would be by the Chatas, it would be left to graze, and it's going to be karb shlam if the equivalent by the Chatas would die. But if the karban Chatas was dechuya, not avuda, not because it was lost, but it got rejected, for example, let's say the carbon is here, it wasn't lost, but it's already past its year, then it's rejected from being sacrificed. That Shmuel never said this klal. You're right, that's different Chatas from shlamim. In that case of Avish Nasa, Chatas would be Raya, and by Pesach it would be karb shlamim, which doesn't work with his klal, because his klal wasn't talking about all the cases of Chatas HaMesis. It was only in the case that you could have sometimes Chatas Mesa and sometimes Chatas Raya. Which case is that? By Avuda. Avuda, sometimes, which is Kippur Ba'aleh, you'll have Mesa and sometimes you'll have Raya, which is going to explain when you have Raya. But that's what the Gemara is qualifying. That in that case of Avudin is where we said that you'll have the rule of Shmuel. But in the other case of Dechuyin, he didn't say his rule. And therefore you're right, you could have a discrepancy between Chatas and Pesach. Okay, but the Gemara is not done with this. The Gemara continues. Okay, fine. You tell me it's only in Avud, so you're fine. You're qualifying it specifically in that case. But the Gemara still has a difficulty with that too. Do you really have even the case of being lost of the Chatas being the equivalent with the Pesach? But Varei Avud b'Shas Hafrasham, it gets a little bit more complicated over here because the wording and what it means and how we're interpreting this. If it's lost during the time of the Hafrasha, as Rashi explains. If you have a Chatas, and the reason why we're using these different words is because in Chatas we explain it one way, just because of the context, and then the application to Psachim we might use different ones. But if you have a Chatas that was lost, until you went and you separated another one to take its place. Okay, where's my chatas? I don't know. I have to bring a carbon chatas. You have to bring a carbon chatas. Now, thing is, you find the original one before you sacrifice the second one. So again, it was avud b'shas hafrasha versus b'shas kapara. The original chatas wasn't when I was separating the second one. Obviously, why did I separate the second one? Because the first one was lost. That's called avud b'shas hafrasha. L'Rabbanan, according to Rabbanan, that they disagree with Rabbi Mesechtes Temura, and they say Dilariya Azla. That case, when the original one was lost at the time when they designated the second one, when they subsequently find that original one, it's going to graze. Where do we find this? Now, like we mentioned Mesechtes Temura. Hifresh chatas evad. Okay, guy separated kama chatas. He lost it. He's looking, he can't find it. Okay, he goes and he separates another one to take its place. What can I do? I lost whatever that was. I got a new carbon. And then you find the first one. And they're both there now. What are you going to do? You have the original and you have the replacement one. This is essentially what we call avud b'shas hafrasha. It was lost not at the time of the kapara. It was lost at the time when you had separated the second one. So here we have machlekes in the Mishnah what the halacha is. Achas men tikriv. So, okay, well, you're going to sacrifice one of them. Obviously, you have two to choose from. V'shniya tamus. Rebbe holds the second one is left to die. That's what Rebbe holds. The Chachamim say no. Echatas meisa. Chatas doesn't die because the owner got atonement with some other carbon. Ella only if it was lost at the time of the kapara, not at the time of the hafrosh like they're discussing over here. Only during the time of the kapara. Shenintzis la'achar shenskava bailim. Only was found after the owner got atonement. But if it was before the owner got atonement, then the Rabban holds it's actually not going to be left to die, it's going to graze. Oh, so like the Gemara says, so if it's before that the owner got atonement, since the Rabban say it's not going to die, so then essentially this is what's called moisur chatas, the leftover chatas. The halach is going to be that raya, it's going to graze, develops a blemish, and its monies are going to be put into those shofars, to those boxes in the base of Mikdash. So you see in this case of avuda b'shas hafrasha, what's the halacha b'chatas? It's going to be raya, according to Rabban. Frekti Gemara, the Ilu Pesach. Now, if that same exact case by the carbon Pesach, heicha da avid, if it was lost, when? If it was lost at the time of hafrasha, the original was lost when you were replacing it, and you found the original afternoon, kaidim shchita, before you slaughtered the second one, the halacha is karev shlamim. It sacrifices the shlam. Now Rashi points out what's obviously very important for the Gemara's question. That's not according to everyone, and that's going to be an important piece. It's going like Rabbi Zeir, who we had Kura in the previous daf. He says, what's the kaveya? What makes it rejected or not? If it's before chatzos or after chatzos. We said if it's found before chatzos and therefore it's around at the time of chatzos, so then it's going to be rejecting it because it was around. So then it's going to be right. It's going to be has to go out the grave. If it's found after chatzos, even before the second one was sacrificed, then we brought it as a shlamim. So obviously we see that the Pesach, even if it's in front of us at the time of the atonement, as long as it's lost by chatzos, it's going to be sacrificed as a shlamim. So that contradicts the rule, because even now by the case of Avuda, which you're telling me that's the case, is that Shmuel's talking about comparing that of Chatas to that Pesach. What's the halacha by Avuda b'shas hafrasha? You tell me from the Rabbanan that if you're going, that the halacha is going to be that by Chatas, it's going to be Raya. But if you hold like Reb Zera by Karban Pesach, what's the halacha with Avuda b'shas hafrasha? If it was after Chatzos, before the Shechita, it's going to be brought as a Shlamim. So you see, it's not totally Avuda b'shas hafrasha by Pesach, exactly like that of Chatas. Because Avuda b'shas hafrasha by Chatas is going to be Raya, and by Pesach it's going to be as a Shlamim. At least in that case of Avuda b'shas hafrasha. Obviously it's Avuda b'shas hafrasha, that's why you went and separated another one. And if it's before the second one was sacrificed, which we don't make such a differentiation by Chatas, you see that's going to be brought as a Shlamim. Why? It should be Raya. So, says the Gemara, it's not difficult, because there was at least two variables that the question was based on. The premise was you're going like the Rabbanan, and that you hold by Chatas, and that you hold like Reb Zeir by Pesach. So it says the Gemara, Shmuel Kremis really. He held it doesn't like Rabbanan, and therefore his ruling is not difficult. He held like Rebbe, the Amad that he says, Avuda, that when you have, as we just quoted in the Mishnah just before in Temura, when you have the Chatas that's lost, Lamisa Azla. It actually is actually left to die. So now, as that Rashi points out, so we're going to have to figure out, according to Shmuel, it's going to shortly explain, so what is the case by Chatas that's going to be Raya? Because according to Rebbe, it would seem like all of the cases would die when it's lost. Now, Rashi points out also, well, but first, before we get further, meaning, so what's the Gemara answering? The Gemara is saying that according to Rebbe, the rule works out. Because actually, when it's a Avud B'Shas, the person is going to die. That's exactly what Shmuel had said. When Chatzis dies, Pesach is brought to Shlama. Now, well, Rashi does point out, the Gemara could have answered on the other variable and said, wait, Shmuel doesn't hold a good Zera. Shmuel has a Grabba, that he says that it depends if the original one was found before the Shechita, the second one, or after the Shechita. Oh, so then Pesach is actually the same halacha. If it's lost B'Shas Hafrasha, after Chatzis, it actually goes out to grace. And Rashi says, you're right. The Gemara later on does give that approach, ultimately rejects that, but that's also another viable answer to say, on Pesach, and not on the Chatzis, but in the Pesach end, what would be the problem? That to say, oh, it'd be Karva Shlom, it's not true. According to Rabbah, it actually would not be brought to Shlom, it actually would be Raya because it depends on the Shechita itself, and it was rejected at the time of Shechita. Okay, but now the Gemara asks on this too. And says, wait a second. Okay, so you're telling me the reason why it's not difficult is first of all, you qualify. It's not going on all Chamesh Chatzos and It's only going in the case of Avud, which is when it's lost, which is called Kippur Ba'aleh, the only guy to tell me something else. Not only that, you just said he's going like Rebbe, which according to Rebbe, therefore it's going to work out because he's going to say that by Chatzos is always going to die, basically. So it's always going to die, so therefore it makes sense in this case also, like by Shlamim, that by Pesach is made brought as a Shlam. Problem is, Kol Avud Rebbe Mason. Rebbe holds every case of a chatzis that's lost is going to die. He doesn't hold of, everyone agrees that Avud B'Shas Kapar is going to die. The question was Avud B'Shas and Frasha. So Rebbe says even over there is going to be left to die, not like Rabban. So the problem is, V'ilum Pesach, but you have a case of Pesach, Hechid Avud Koydin Chatzais. If you lost the Korban Pesach before Chatzais, V'nimtza Koydin Chatzais, and you find it before Chatzais, then even according to Reb Zera, the law is going to be Raya, because Chatzais, everyone agrees, even though it's going to establish it's going to be rejected. So if you find it before Chatzais, it's going to be the at Chatzais, it's going to be at the Shechita. Everyone's going to agree in that case it's going to be left to graze because it's being rejected. But wait a second, didn't you tell me whoever Chatzais is going to die that by Pesach it's going to be Karva Shlamim? Yet here you have a case that everyone would agree it's going to be left to graze because it's being rejected when either by Chatzais or when you bring the second one. But why? It doesn't fit the rule. Says the Gemara, no. Koydem Chatzais, before noon, which is a time that is not even fit to sacrifice as a carbon, so then that case is lav oven. That's not considered as quote unquote lost. And even if you separate another one to take the place before you found it, that's not quote unquote called lost. So it's not lost. It's not a problem with the case that Shmuel is discussing. Meaning you're right, it's going to be rejected, and then it's going to be left to graze. But it doesn't reject Shmuel's his terminology. His terminology was wherever my chatzis is going to die, whenever it's going to graze, it's going to graze by Pesach too. Now, which case do we say he's talking about? By Avudin. What is Avudin? Avudin is only, at least my chatzis is going to shortly quote right now, is if it was able to be sacrificed and you lost it. Oh, that's what we're talking about this halacha. But losing the Pesach before chatzis and finding before chatzis, it was never lost. It was never fit to be brought yet to be considered lost, so therefore that doesn't go into his categorical definition. Yes, it could be right over there, even though by Chatzis it's going to be Mesa, because it's not the category of Avud. It's not lost yet. You have to be able to be lost. You never were found to be lost. It's like something like that. The Amar Rabba, like Rabba says regarding a Chatzis, he says that Vegas Lailom says if the Karma Chatzis is lost at nighttime, and so he's lost, he's kicked, it's 12 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock at night, and we got to bring a Chatzis tomorrow. Okay, he goes and he separates another one to take its place. And then, before daybreak, he finds the original one. So even according to Rebbe that we say that even if it's found before Kapara, it's going to be dying, you can leave it to die, he would agree that it's not going to be left to die. It's actually going to graze, because nighttime is not a time that you could sacrifice it. So Av Shema Ved, it's not called lost, and therefore it's not going to have that categorical definition to compare Pesach to that case. Okay. And then the Gemara has a different question. But the problem is there was two halves to Shmuel's statement. Raya l'Rebbe, the case of when it's lost, that according to Rebbe is going to be left to graze, How are you going to have that case to say the other half of a statement? I understand that you've resolved for me the first half of the statement that kol shebechatas mesa that by Pesach is mikar b'shlamim, because it's going only in avudin, according to Rabbi, and it has to be an exact case of avudin. So okay, we figured that out. That's always going to be by Pesach mikar b'shlamim. It's going like Rabbi. It's also only when it's really lost, when it's before chatzas and it's found before chatzas, it's not really lost yet. Okay, so even though it is going to be left to graze, it's not the case for Toma. But if it's after chatzas, before the second one was sacrificed, so then it's going to be carved as a shlamim, because you're going like Rabbi. Because according to Rabbi, that's going to be chatzas going to be mesa. So you have resolved the cases up until this point. Problem is, what do you do with the second half of the statement? How are you going to have a case of chatzas raya? According to Rabbi, it always dies. Whenever it's lost, whenever you have the categorical definition of lost, again, if it was before during nighttime, it says not called lost. Rebbe would agree with it, it's going to be left to graze. But any avudin is always going to die. So when do you have in the category of avudin, the chat is going to be roya, tell me that Pesach is going to be roya. You don't have such a case. So the Gemara continues on the base and says, can you Rabbi Shloimy? It's not like Rabbi Shloimy. Because Amar Rabbi Shloimy says, Hifrashtei Chatayis Lachrai is a very different case. But that would be the case that we'll see. According to Rabbi, you could have a chatas that's going to be quote unquote lost, that you leave it to grace. Yeah, if you have shtei chatayis lachrais, what happens is a guy, he's that type of guy. He wants to make sure he has all his bases covered, so he brings two chatayis, just in case. Yeah, he's the just in case here. Yeah, in case one gets lost, he'll bring the other one. Now, actually, Rashi says that the Gemara really could have asked at this point. That's not really considered lost. Again, it's the same idea that we said it's not lost, but the Gemara asks a different question anyway. But the point is, the Gemara says that Rabbi says if you separated two chatayis, one for insurance for the other one, so what's halacha? You got to tell one of them. V'shneya tira. The second one, obviously, when you don't use it, it gets rejected and it's left to graze till it develops a blemish. So Rabbi agrees that the chatas, if you get the atonement, the other one in this case is not going to be left to die. It only is a certain case. Here, it's only going to be rejected, but those which were never rejected, that meaning in other words, the halacha mishmasin specifically regarding those 5 chatayis hamesis. But here, in this case, where it was never really rejected because he never really planned on bringing it, it was really just as insurance. He would agree that it's not going to be left to die, but rather it's going to graze till it develops a blemish. Oh, so that's the case. We're going to Rabbi, you how quote unquote navuda, that's going to be groy. Problem is, it doesn't fit the rule because ve'ilu b'pesach yagavna. The equivalent in Pesach in such a case actually would be karev shlamim, be sacrificed shlamim, because you know what that case is in the equivalent by Pesach? It's Meiser Pesach. That's the classic Meiser Pesach. But the classic Meiser Pesach is you got a bunch of money. You said, okay, this is for the Pesach fund, and you didn't need it. You had just in case you got a bunch more money. It comes out the animal is so much cheaper that year. So for that or separate, that's not rejected. So that's actually sacrifice of shlamim, and it's not roya. So your whole answer to say that's like Rabbi, to show a case of Rabbi of Raya, that doesn't work out with the rule of Pesach being Raya. Because actually in that case, Pesach will be covered Shlam. So rather, the Gemara concludes like this, that the truth is that you don't need to find out a case of Chatas being Raya, because Shmuel Krib Shimon's really. Shmuel's like Reb Shimon, the Amar that he says in Seftas Timura, Chamesh Chatayis Mesis. There are 5 Chatayis that are mentioned that they are left to die, and they die no matter what the situation is. So if you have a chatas that only got atonement, the animal that was lost is automatically going to die, whether it's found before the atonement, whether it's found after the atonement, whether you had separated fachrayas, the leftover one is always going to be left to die. So now we understand that, the case of Rabbi Isha actually why it's going to be the shlam by Pesach, the sacrifice of shlamim, because actually that case is not like Rabbi Isha. It's actually going to be mesa. So that's why the equivalent by Pesach, in that case, we cover shlamim, which is the case we just discussed. When you mafresh time lachrayis, it's actually not going to be by sheni yirayah. It's actually going to be like Reb Shimon, always going to die. But the problem is you still have now the original question. But then Reb Shimon, that you just answered why the equivalent of Pesach will work out with that of the chatas, but Reb Shimon less like klal. Reb Shimon never has a case of it being left to graze because he always holds going to die by avuda and the other cases. So then what Shmuel is saying, that Chol Shebechatas Raya, that by Pesach is going to be left to graze also, you never have a case of Chatas being Raya. It's always going to die by Avudah when it's lost. So the Gemara says, you're right. Shmuel nami chada kamar. This is where the Gemara concludes. Shmuel really was only talking about one case. That is the case of Kippur Ba'aleha, which is when the owner got atonement with another carbon, therefore when that one was lost. And he was only saying one principle. He was saying, Kol Shabbachatas Mesa, wherever the animal dies, because you had atonement with another carbon and it was lost, the Pesach carved Shlamim, by the Pesach, we sacrifice the Shlamim, and he didn't say a second half of the statement. Now, that's it, that ends it, because he's going like Rabbi Shimon, he's going like Rabbi, that there's only chatois amesis, and there's not going to be any chatois, it's actually going like Rabbi Shimon, there's not going to be any chatois that are royal. And that's the rule, so whatever chatois amesis, by Pesach we carve Shlamim. Now, as Rashi points out, that obviously, since all the lost karbanos by Pesach are going to be sacrificed as a Shlamim, and we're saying Shmuel is saying one teaching, obviously he has to be going like Rabbi Shimon. Why? Because if you think he's going like Rabbi or like Rabbanan, they hold that there are cases that by Chat is going to be raya. Like we pointed out, according to Rabbanan, for sure this case is raya. That's if it's Avud B'Shas Afrasha. And according to Rabbi, we also found one like Rabbi Yishia, when you hifresh Tei Chatois La'Chrayis. So, if Shmuel would hold like either Rebbe or like Rabbanan, then why would he say this one sentence of wherever Chattas it dies? But Pesach is Mikar B'Shlamim. What do you mean? Even when the Chattas is Raya, which according to those Tanam you do have a case of Raya, but Pesach is also Mikar B'Shlamim, which those were the questions we had been asking on those opinions. But now that we say Shmuel is like Rabbi Shimon, so it's a bona fide simon. Because there is no case of lost Chattas that doesn't die, and there's no case of lost Chattas of Pesach that's not carved as a Shlamim. So that's a perfect simon. And there's no other half of this. I mean, you're right, there is no other half of Kosher Chattas Roya at Pesach Roya. Maybe the one who had originally said it thought, if you're saying Chattas Mesa, Pesach Karv Shlamim, that must mean where Chattas is Roya, then Shlam is also Roya. But the truth is, he's going like Reb Shimon, and there is no such case. It was only the first sentence. And then the Gemara says, wait a second, my Kamash Malan. So then, what Shmuel coming to teach us? In other words, since you tell me wherever you have a lost Chattas, it's going to be, and then you find the original one, meaning that one that was lost, it's going to be left to die. And Shmuel's coming to say, wherever it's lost by Pesach, we sacrifice the Shlamim. That's our Mishnah. The Mishnah said, if the Pesach is found after the Shechita, the original one is found after the replacement one is slaughtered. Now, we had explained previously, what does that mean? It means, like Rabbi Zera said, after the time of Shechita, then it's going to be, if you find it not after the Shechita, but after the time of the Shechita, which is after Chatzais, then it's going to be sacrificed. Obviously, that the Mishnah holds that if it's lost at the time of Chatzais, it's going to be sacrificed. Like we said before, Chatzais is not considered lost. See, if it's lost by Chatzais, it's going to be sacrificed as Shlom. So our Mishnah already teaches us this halacha already. So what do you need Shmuel then for? Says the Gemara, Lafuka with Rabbi Yecha. It's coming to exclude from Rabbi Yecha that he disagrees on Shmuel, and this is what we had said from Amid Aleph. We had quoted Rabbi Yecha, we didn't really explain what was it. Rabbi Yecha was disagreeing with Shmuel. We spent the whole Amid Aleph and the beginning part of Amid Beis discussing Shmuel. So he's saying Shmuel's teaching is coming to exclude from Rabbi Yecha. Because the Amar, he had said, after we quoted Shmuel, we quoted Rabbi Yecha, and he says, Eina Pesach Shekar Shlamim. He says, no, the Pesach is not sacrificed as a Shlamim, Ela Shenim Tza'achar Shechita. Only if it's found after you slaughtered the replacement one. Of a Kayin Shechita, but if you found the original before the second one was slaughtered, even though it was lost by Chatzais, no, it's not going to be brought as a Shlamim. Rather, the Pesach will be left to grace. Why? Because it's the actual slaughtering of the second one that makes it into, which is really like Rabbah from the previous half, that makes the first one rejected. Says the Gemara, so we see that according to Rabbi Yechanan, Shchita Kava. Rabbi Yechanan knows what makes it rejected is the slaughtering. Kamash Malan, that's what Shmuel's coming to tell us when he says this line. Kol Shabachatas Mesa, wherever Chat's going to die. Which is who? Like Reb Shimon. That he says, if it's lost at the time of the Hafrasha, meaning if the original was lost, when you separate, you designate the replacement, then whenever you find the original one's going to die, Shmuel's coming to tell us that no, Chatzais Kava. That not the Shechita, but it's the Chatzais that makes it, and then subsequently, so essentially the Chiddush of Shmuel is that if it's lost during the time of the Hafrasha, which is when, already from Chatzais, which is when you could be mafresh the Korban Pesach, that point onward, the original one is called lost. Even if it's found before you shech the second one, what's the halacha going to be? You're going to sacrifice it as a shlamim. because chatzais is what establishes as rejected, like Reb Zera holds. So says Rashi, so now, even though we're explaining that Shmuel is talking about one teaching, you can't go and now explain, which was, we had originally said, that Shmuel is not talking about all the 5 chatzos and mesas. He's only talking about that of the avuda. And the reason why we said it was because he was saying 2 halves of a statement. And we had asked regarding the case of Raya. Well, now he's not talking about Raya anymore, now he's talking about mesas. So maybe we could talk about even the case of Mesa Ba'aleha. So says Rashi, no. Because all Mesa Ba'aleha, whenever the owner dies, the chatz is always going to die. By Pesach, however, if the owner dies after chatzais, actually the Korban Pesach is going to be left to graze. Because chatzais is what establishes it as kavua, and now it can be rejected. And you cannot say also that Shmuel holds that chatzais does not make it kavua rather than the shita, because Rabbi Yechanan is his disputant. And Rabbi Yechanan holds that it's the shita. Obviously, that must be that Shmuel holds that. Well, first of all, if Rabbi Yechanan is saying that it's the shita, it must be talking about that it was lost, because that's only regarding if the owner died or was past his year. It's not the shechita the second one that rejects that one. It's because it's over the year. The only case that would be the second one's shechita rejecting is the case of avuda. So you see that from Rabbi Yechanan, who's disputing Shmuel, that there must be the talking about the case of avuda, because that's why it's the shechita the second one that rejects it. And moreover, Rabbi Yechanan must be talking about avuda because he says nimtza. So obviously it's only the case of avuda. Okay. So that was one interpretation of this halacha of Shmuel. Now, Lishna Achrina, another version, like Rashi explains, we're going back on the original question. We had asked on Shmuel's klal that on the case of avuda, when the original Korban Pesach was lost, the question was, wait a second, this simon doesn't work out so well, because by chatas, if it's lost at the time of the hafrasha, we had asked, according to Rabbanan, the halacha is it's going to be left to graze. The ilu b'pesach. This is where our Gemara takes off from that middle of the question. The ilu b'pesach, the equivalent case by Pesach, David, where it was lost, and you find it afternoon. But koydim shchita, before the slaughtering of the replacement, the halacha is yikrav shlamim. It's to be sacrificed by the shlamim, which, as Rashi points out, in the Gemara's question's premise is based on the Rabbanan and like Reb Zera. Now, even though that this case is talking about where it's avid b'shas hafrasha, because after chatzos is when you mafresh the replacement, it wasn't makriv, but it was after the hafrasha. That case you tell me chatas according to Rabbanan it's going to be raya. Yet by Pesach according to Reb Zera, since it wasn't there at the time of chatzos, it's going to be brought as a shlamim. So that was the Gemara's original question. So on Amud Aleph we had said, oh, okay, Shmuel doesn't go like Rabbanan. It goes like Rabbi. But we held Rabbi. Says, oh, he holds like Reb Shimon. Oh, and Rabbi only says a half of a statement. He's only going, there's no other half of Kol Shal Chatas Roya. Because that was how the Gemara originally said. The Gemara wants to take a different path. The Gemara says, Shmuel Karamis, really. Forget about that variable of what the halach is by Chatas. The reason why it's not a problem is because regarding that of Pesach, he doesn't know like Reb Zera. He holds like Reb Abba. Dama, that he says that the halacha, the Mishnah, was literally not before Zman Shkita like Reb Zera, like with the premise of Chatzos was being asked from. No, the halacha Mishnah was if you find it before the actual slaughtering of the replacement one, he holds Shchita kava. He holds the actual slaughtering is what establishes it. So if it's found before the Shchita, meaning even though it's after Chatzos, it is going to graze by the Korban Pesach. So that's exactly what Rabbi holds by the Chatas. You have to graze. So there's no question. However, the Gemara rejects this because so that's how you're trying to answer me Shmuel. That Shmuel is going like Rabbah. That's the shchita that's kaveya, and therefore that'll work out with the rule of kol shalachatas mesa pesach karv shlamim. And wherever it's roya, would you tell me that this case is roya by the chatas? Oh, yeah. So that's the truth. If he goes like Rabbah, it's going to be roya over here. It's going to be rejected over here by the shchita. So the way you can't say that because from the comment Rabbi Yechon on the record, Rabbi Yechon says on Shmuel. Eina pesach karv shlam. No, Shmuel, no, you're not correct. The Korban Pesach is not sacrificed to the shlamim. Only you find it after the slaughtering of the second one. If the shchita is not going to be the case, obviously, according to Rabbi Yochanan, what's he saying? Shchita kava. What establishes the title of Pesach to say if the other one's around now it's going to be rejected is the actual slaughtering of the second one. So the inference obviously is that he's disagreeing with Shmuel. The Shmuel, so obviously Shmuel must hold, not like that, he must hold Chatzis kava. Must be that Chatzis is what establishes it. And so then you're back to the question. So over here, since that Chatzis was lost, he only found it after Chatzis, then it should not be rejected. It should be read as a shlamim. So obviously according to Shmuel, that if it's lost during the time of the Afrasha, even though it was there at the time of the Kapara, it is brought as a shlamim. Which, then we're back to the question. That's not like the Rabbanan by Chatas, that's going to be right. That doesn't fit the rule. You said by Pesach, the Chatas is right, but Pesach should be right. So the Rebbe says the Gemara, you're right, rather like we said in Amid Aleph. Shmuel Kurebi Srile. The reason why it's not difficult is not because from Pesach side that he's like Rabbah, you're right, he's like Zera, but it's because of the Chatas side. He holds like Rebbe, he says he says that when it's lost, it's going to die. So that's why Bakram Pesach Mikra is a shlamim, because that's the rule. It's not kosher b'chatas roya here anymore. Rebbe holds it's a case of kosher b'chatas mesa. That's why the equivalent by Pesach is mikra as a shlamim. But the problem is, like we have mentioned the same question on Aleph, but for kol avud Rebbe Mason. What do I mean? But then but the difficulty is Rebbe holds every case of avud mesa. By Pesach, if you lose it before chatzais and you find it before chatzais, then everyone agrees it's going to be left to graze because even by chatzais, it's already here already, so it's going to be rejected. Says the Gemara, that's not difficult. Because he holds Kaim Chatzais, and we answered this question on Aleph. Kaim Chatzais lav avaru. Before Chatzais not lost, and the the reason is because he holds Chatzais kava. Chatzais is what establishes it. So therefore, if it wasn't him, if it was lost and found beforehand, it wasn't even in the category of it being avuda, and that's where the Gemara ends over here. It doesn't continue on with the questions that we had asked. So then, what are you going to do with the second half of Raya and then to say it's like Reb Shimon? This is where the Gemara ends, but it ultimately rejects that interpretation of saying that it would be like Rabbah. Rather, it goes back to the first interpretation of saying that he's going like Rebbe, and therefore that's why it's a case of kosher b'chatas mesa, and that by Pesach would be carved as a shlamim, and it's not difficult why it's not going to be right. Something to discuss in today's Daf, in Pesachim Daf, Sadi Zayin, was that we basically said this one teaching of Shmuel. He said two statements. He said, at least originally, whoever by Chatas is going to die, Pesach is in Borz Islam. Whoever by Chatas is going to graze, Pesach is also going to graze. Now Rabbi Yochanan said, which when you're just reading the Gemara, it's hard to know exactly what the comparison is. What's he disagreeing with Shmuel? He says no, the Pesach is only brought as a shlamim, only if it's found when? After the Shechita. You find it before the Shechita, then when you do the Shechita of the replacement one, it's rejecting the first one. So it's going to graze. Only if you find the original one after the Shechita, it wasn't rejected, it wasn't around, then it's to be carved as a shlamim. That's what Rabbi Yochanan said. Now, but first thing we're discussing the teaching of Shmuel. It says, wait a second. Whenever Chatas Meisi covers them, whenever Chatas Raya, doesn't mean Raya. But you have a Chatas Sha'av Shnasa, where if it past its year, so you can't bring as a cover anymore. What's Allah by Chatas? If you left to graze, yet Pesach, in such a case, the Gemara proves that it's brought as a shlamim. That doesn't go well with the rule. You're supposed to say by Pesach it's going to be right. So the Gemara says, you're right. No. Shmuel was not talking about every case of Chatas and Mesis. Shmuel was talking about the case of when it's lost, which is 1 out of the 5. 1 out of the 5 is the case of Avudah. On that case is where Shmuel said his rules. That's where he wasn't talking about the case of the Chuyin, of let's say of Mesu Ba'aleha or Avishnasa. He wasn't talking about that case. Okay, so therefore by Avudim the rule will hold true. Wherever Chatas Mesa, Pesach Shlamim, wherever Chatas Raya, Pesach Raya. Problem is you still have a difficulty. Even in the case of Avudah, which is the case you said you're talking about. If it's Avudah B'Shas Hafrash, if the original was lost when you separated a new one, a replacement one, according to the Rabbanan, the halacha is that it goes to graze. It doesn't die. They hold it's only if it's Avudah B'Shas Kapara. But if it's Avudah B'Shas Hafrash, it's going to left to graze. The problem is, by Pesach, where it's lost, and then you find it after Chatzais, before the Shechita, again, because we're presuming that they're going like Reb Zera, halach is going to be sacrificed as a shlamim. Why is it as a shlamim? Because during Chatzais, which is Reb Zera, it wasn't there. They only found it after Chatzais, so it wasn't rejected. So by Pesach, it's going to be brought as a shlamim. But wait a second, that's a case of Avudah B'Shas Hafrasha. And by chatas, you tell me it's going to graze, and here you tell me that it's going to be sacrificed. It's supposed to be grazed. So the Gemara says, no, it's not difficult. Because Shmuel holds like Rabbi. That holds Avuda always goes to die. Even in Avuda B'Shas Afrasha. Oh, okay. So that makes sense. That's exactly the rule. B'Chatas is going to be Mesa, and by Pesach is going to be Rabbi Shlomo. What do you do with? But what do you do if it was found before Chatzos? That's a discrepancy. That's not a discrepancy because that's not considered Avuda. It doesn't go into his ruling. That's not considered like Avuda B'Shas Light was not considered lost. Even Rebbe would agree with this, not going to die. So that's not a difficulty. That could be a discrepancy between Chatzos and Pesach. Now, but then the Gemara has a question that says, wait, but how do you do with the second half of the statement of Shmuel? Raya, according to Rabbi, where are you going to have such a case? It's always going to die. Oh, I'll tell you a case. Remember Aisha, when you separated two originally you brought two. You didn't not like you lost one and you brought two of them originally. Say in case one happens to one, I have the other one. Yeah, you have fachrais. Yeah, you could. That's Rabbi Shloimy halacha that you could. The question is exactly how does that work? But so it's designating both of them. So what's the halacha then? So then the shnei will be tirah. Then it's going to be left to graze. Oh, you have a case of right. Problem is. Back to the question, Pesach in such a case, it's actually going to be sacrificed as a shlamim. That doesn't fit well with the rule. Wherever there's right, it's going to be right over here. So I said, oh, you're right. No, really, Shmuel is going like Rabbi Shimon, not going like Rabbi. Who holds every case is always going to die, all the chamash chatois. So it's not going to be right. Oh, so that's why that case by Pesach is going to be brought as a shlamim, because it's chatois hamesis. But then we're back to the question, how do you have right according to Rabbi Shimon? You never have a case of raya. Every chat is always going to die by Avuda. So the Gemara says you're right. This is what the Gemara concludes and says that Shmuel is only saying one statement. He didn't say the second half of the statement wherever it's Roy B'Chatas, Roy B'Shlam. Because you don't have a Roy B'Chatas. It's always, because you're talking about Avuda, it's always going to be a case of Mesa. So what's the Chiddush? That was already known from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah already told us this halacha, that when you find it after Chatzais, or it could be beforehand, it's not even considered laws, find it after Chatzais, that it's going to be Karvaz Shlamim. So what's the Chiddush that you're teaching us that we don't know from the Mishnah? Oh, he's coming to exclude from that of Rabbi Yechanan. Because Rabbi Yechanan had said that the shchit is koiveya. Those were the words of Rabbi Yechanan. He says, no, Shmuel, no, it's only karvas as long as it's found after the shchita. Before the shchita, it's going to be raya. On that, Shmuel is coming to disagree. He says, no, chatzais is koiveya. And therefore, if it's Avuda B'Shas Afrasha, it's going to die by chatas, which that's the equivalent by Pesach, it's going to be karvas as shlamim. That's the chiddush Shmuel is coming to teach us, which is essentially to say, like that of Rabbah, like to say that of Reb Zera, and not like that of Rabbah. Now, the Gemara brings another answer, which was ultimately rejected, that to try to say that Shmuel is like Rabbah. The reason why it's not difficult is, you're right, he holds like Rabbanan, that it's going to be Raya by Chatas. So then, wait a second, shouldn't it be Raya by Pesach? Oh, he holds like Rabbah that holds the Shchitas Kaveya. And you're right, that case of Nimtza Achar Chatzais, but before the Shchita, it actually will be Raya, because the Shchita of the second one, which was there at that time, actually did reject it, and it's going to be left to graze. But the Gemara says, no, you can't say that, because Rabbi Yechanan, who's the disputant of Shmuel, he holds Shchitas Kaveya. You can't tell me Shmuel holds a Shchitas Kaveya, must be holds Chatzais Kaveya. Says Kaveya, then back to the question, that's going to be a case if it was not there at Chatzais, and you found it after Chatzais. But Pesach, you're only like Reb Zera, not like Rabbah, it was not rejected. It was not rejected, so then it's brought as a shlamim. But that case by Chatas, you tell me is going to be Raya. But that doesn't work out with the rule. So the Gemara comes back to the original part, says, yeah, it must be like Rebbe, not like Rabbanan, who holds that's the case of Chatas Mesa, and then that to be the equivalent by Pesach, that's be carved as a shlamim. I can do it anytime. For hosting.